Okay, lecture number 3 here. We're going to talk a little bit more about central nervous system tissues and structures, and we're going to see it's not only about neurons in the central nervous system. This is a pretty nice little diagram which is showing you what's going on inside nervous tissue. So nervous tissue is one of the 4 major tissue types, if you remember that from back in Unit 2, if you haven't tried to repress those memories yet. And so I said at that time we would discuss nervous tissue in a little bit more detail when we got to Unit 5. So this is a pretty nice little diagram which is showing you some different cell types that you would find in the nervous tissue in your central nervous system, so brain and spinal cord. And of course, all right, so right there you've got, that is a neuron. Here's another neuron over here. Those are multipolar type neurons. So we have discussed those already. But then there are some other cell types in here we're going to be taking a look at. The other cell types are broadly classified as neuroglia or glial cells, and they play various supporting roles in the nervous system. And so some of these are called astrocytes. So if you look over here, this greenish cell they've got drawn in there, which has lots of little extensions. And notice that those extensions are connecting this capillary, that's a blood vessel, to this neuron over here. And we'll talk shortly about what these astrocytes do in a little bit more detail. That's one type. And then these guys over here, right there, and right there, those are called microglia. And they're kind of like the macrophages of your central nervous system. They play roles similar to those. Ependymal cells, that's another cell type in the central nervous system. You see these over here in yellow. Those are cells that line compartments in the brain that contain cerebrospinal fluid. They're called your brain ventricles. So when we're learning about the ventricles over on the anatomy side, these ependymal cells line those spaces, those ventricle spaces where that cerebrospinal fluid is located. Then you have some cells called oligodendrocytes. Those are these guys over here. And if you look closely at them, they have little extensions extending off of them. And they're the cells in the central nervous system that make the myelin sheathing. Okay, so in the peripheral nervous system, those were called Schwann cells that did that. And the Schwann cell itself was sitting along the axon. In the central nervous system, there are cells called oligodendrocytes. They send out little extensions, and then those extensions wrap myelin around the axons of neurons in the central nervous system. So the cell body is not actually sitting right along the axon in this case. And if you notice here on the diagram, your oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system can actually, your cell body's kind of sitting out there in the center, and this one has sent out extensions that are myelinating multiple neurons. All right, and in the peripheral nervous system, we've talked about the Schwann cells before, and we'll briefly mention another cell type in the peripheral nervous system called satellite cells. All right, how about these astrocytes? So this is a picture from your textbook showing one of these in more detail. They're the most abundant of the neuroglia, these supporting cells in the central nervous system. And one of the things they do, they're called astrocytes because they kind of look like stars. And all those little appendages they have, they're not really dendrites. These are not electrical signaling cells like neurons. They play supportive roles. And one of the things that they do is they bridge these blood vessels, these capillaries, very small blood vessels, bridge those to neurons. And so why might that be happening? So neurons need lots of oxygen, they need lots of glucose and other nutrients, they need their wastes taken away. So the astrocytes actually play a role in helping that happen, and they play structural roles within the central nervous system as well by helping to kind of provide a framework and some support for all these neurons and blood vessels and other cell types you have there in the central nervous system. Astrocytes have lots of roles, summarized here on this slide. They've got those little appendages that attach to neurons. Their endings, the synaptic endings, capillaries, they help support and brace the neurons, as I was just mentioning. This is important too. They help determine capillary permeability. So that is, here capillary permeability means, well, how easy is it for substances in the blood to get out of the blood and into those tissue fluids in the central nervous system. So if we go backwards over here, well, let's just take a look at right here on this diagram. And you got all these substances over here in your blood vessels. You got all this interstitial fluid in your central nervous system tissues, just like you have elsewhere in the body. The astrocytes control how easy it is for things to get out and go back in to those blood vessels. So your capillaries in the central nervous system are not as leaky as they are in other parts of the body. So the astrocytes are helping out with something we call the blood-brain barrier. It is not as easy in your central nervous system for substances to pass out of the bloodstream and into the interstitial fluids of those tissues. The brain is protected from that type of thing, which is a good thing, because imagine if you had a toxic chemical in your bloodstream, you've been exposed to something toxic, you don't want that getting out of your bloodstream and into your central nervous system tissues as easily as it can in other parts of the body, because if your brain dies, then you're going to die pretty quickly, whereas you might be able to tolerate some poisons in other parts of the body a little bit better. Or if you had a virus or some type of bacteria in your blood, you don't want the virus or the bacteria to be able to move out of the blood and into your central nervous system all that easily. So that's called the blood-brain barrier. It's more difficult for substances to get out of the blood and into your central nervous system tissues. Obviously, good stuff gets out as it's supposed to feed the cells in the CNS, and your wastes need to get back into the bloodstream so that those types of things can be taken away. Other things, astrocytes are thought to help guide migration of young neurons when your central nervous system is developing. You know, how do these neurons know how to network with each other? You know, if you imagine all these billions of neurons in your brain, it's amazing that they're all wired and connected and in just the right way so all this communication can take place how it's supposed to. Astrocytes help control the chemical environment. That kind of gets into the blood-brain barrier issues I was just talking about. And astrocytes are not fully understood yet. It is thought that they somehow participate with information processing that goes on in the brain as well. There are a lot of things we don't know about the nervous system yet, and so sometimes the information we see here in Unit 5 will be a little bit vague at times when there are things that we don't yet understand all that well. Your microglial cells, micro means small, so these are small glial cells. They kind of look like little spiders like you see there, and they're defensive cells. The best way, you know, they're a type of macrophage, so they do phagocytosis. That's their main job. If you do get bacteria, a fungus, viruses, other foreign things in the central nervous system, the microglia are supposed to help you vacuum up those types of things. They are capable of migrating. As you see here on this slide, they can actually migrate towards areas of injury that you have in the central nervous system. So they're going to help clean up. If you do have damage in the central nervous system, they're going to, just like macrophages, phagocytose, ingest your damaged cells and tissues. These microglia will do that for you in the central nervous system. Okay, the ependymal cells, they have kind of a cool name, but in addition to that, you have these fluid-filled cavities in the central nervous system, the ventricles that you're learning about over on the anatomy side, and those contain cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And so those compartments are lined with these ependymal cells that have cilia on the surface that helps with the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid. So they've formed those borders, and then down in here in orange, down in there you're into CNS tissue, nervous tissue, beyond where those ependymal cells are located. So they're forming a lining, kind of a special type of epithelial tissue you have in some areas of the central nervous system. And if you notice here, they're going to form a border between the CNS interstitial fluid, so the fluids that are surrounding those astrocytes and neurons and microglia and all that, from the cerebrospinal fluid that you have in the ventricles of the brain, and then also down in the central canal of the spinal cord as well. That type of fluid flows through there also. Oligodendrocytes, here's a better picture of one of these. So, as I mentioned earlier, the main cell body is off by itself, and then it has little extensions that extend out, and then it produces myelin sheathing that wraps itself around axons in the central nervous system, as you see there. So one oligodendrocyte can have lots of branches on it that myelinate multiple axons or nerve fibers. When you see nerve fiber again in this unit, that word fiber is generally referring to an axon or axons. Okay, something else we've all heard this before, white matter and gray matter in the central nervous system. What does that mean? So here you've got a brain that has been cut open in a section for us. And so if you actually cut open a real human brain, you will see that there are darker areas, especially up here near the surface of the brain. This is a coronal section through the brain. And then internally you see areas that are lighter in color. So your darker areas are called gray matter, and in your gray matter, that's where you mostly have neuron cell bodies and unmyelinated fibers. Not all axons have myelin surrounding them. There are many nerve fibers or axons are unmyelinated. They don't have that insulation. That means their action potentials travel more slowly. If you remember that from Unit 4, myelination helps the nerve impulses travel faster along the axon. The white matter, what you really have in there, you don't have very many cell bodies. You may not have any cell bodies. You just got lots and lots and lots of axons, gazillions of them, and they're myelinated. So you have dense collections of myelinated nerve fibers. And you're going to have some that are transmitting impulses upward toward maybe the edges of the brain up here. Others are going to be transmitting impulses downward, outgoing type impulses. But myelin has a lighter color, kind of a whitish color, and so that's why in areas where you don't have very many cell bodies, you've just got lots of myelinated axons, it takes on a whitish or a lighter color like that. All right, so that concludes kind of a quick overview of some of our central nervous system tissues and structures we'll be hearing about during Unit 5. And on the next video lecture, I'm going to talk about some more specific peripheral nervous system tissues and structures that we'll be hearing about during this unit.